Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Ladies and gentlemen, and everything else, it's me again, Layman Pascal, the Joe Rogan of meta theory, the David Letterman of post-metaphysical spirituality, maybe the Sid Caesar of integrative pluralism, whatever that might mean. Today, let's talk about bodies, specifically about how bodies show up and occupy space, and also about how bodies divide into types, such as sexes, which need to be explored and accounted for in the ways we show up in the world, and the ways we collaborate in healing, growing, and transcending. My guest today is wild vessel guide Hunter Toran. He's going to take us on a wild ride through the flowing somatics of space, time, and masculinity. Hi, Hunter.
Grand risings, Layman. It's beautiful to be here with you.
You too, man. Why don't you briefly give people a sense of the services you provide, and then a little bit about how you got involved in the dharma of bodies in space?
Right. That question, what do you do? Oh, man. Let me go to the files. You know, in the worldly realm, you know, I'm a somatic therapist and educator. You know, that plays out in a lot of ways. Technically, you know, we look at movement. We look at movement as a lens of experience, of a human experience. And how can we utilize movement to initiate change, to plant seeds that will nurture by changing our movement so that we can change the way we think and feel. I do a lot of hands-on energetic work, you know, probably most similar to cranial sacral, looking for the long rhythms, the slow tides that surround, encapsulate, and penetrate the body, the organizing forces that have a song that they're looking for when out of equilibrium. We look for balance here, emotional, physical, intellectual, spiritual, you know, and constantly engaging this query of what it means to be a human. What is the function of this form? You know, and those that cannot join me here in occupied Duwamish territory, Seattle as it's known, I do online coaching, you know, where we look at this narrative. What is the narrative of the body? What is being spoken of our consciousness in the small micro movements and then the larger, grander gestures that have become the habitual aspects of our consciousness? That's what we do here.
Fantastic. What about the lineage? How did you get into all this?
Yes, all love and respect to the teacher. And there have been many along the way. My first real forays, I guess, into movement was through a Taoist Qigong known as Tan Shan, brought by a woman named Annie Kelly in Santa Cruz. But the majority of my study has been with Jamin McMillan at the Spatial Dynamics Institute, just north of Albany, in an old manufacturing town known as Mechanicville. They made train parts. And he bought an old elementary school, you know, on the verge of collapse. And he said, let's not tear this down. And we utilized that gym. I spent thousands of hours in that gym and some of the adjoining rooms and buildings. Jamin, he's a dynamo. He's a master teacher. And his approach is to meet people right where they are. And that's what I strive for, you know, is to meet people where they're at, which is, you know, challenging. I think a great challenge, which I'm continually trying to refine, find new ways to meet. And that's what always touched me most about his teaching is he could tell when it didn't hit. So he teach the same thing in a new way. Maybe rearrange the circle, the seating, switch it up, change the dynamic in the room, bring it again. right? And I feel that's really the responsibility and the marker of a great teacher, is to find a way to bring across his passion and his genius in different ways.
Beautiful.
So they are.
It seems to me that there's on the one hand, a very practical, structural, analytic, technical element to these things, but also a kind of crazy spiritual madness and chaos of embodiment element. How do you hold those two together responsibly?
Right. That's the big one, right? That's the big one. How do we do it? And you're right. When we enter into the anatomy through the lens of, we'll call it somatics for now, is you're engaging a mystery, truly, and to meet the body as what it is it's a miracle. These interchanges, these flowings, these rhythms, these chemical processes, such complexity. So there's a threshold moment when someone, gets into somatics, which I believe is a larger commitment, actually, to explore what is here. And everyone has a different starting point, where they're coming from, what is their lens, how thick is the lens of trauma, how thick is the lens of outer influence, right? Previous experience and context. And so it's the real edge. How do we give them just enough to keep the curiosity alive, but not so much that we overwhelm or that we exalt ourselves as teachers, right? As we strive, like in this time, when the age of the guru is ending, right? The end of Kali Yuga, right? And so it's a continuous exploration for me to find that way. We're helped so much by the minds of the metaverse here, if we can claim that still. The Neurohacker Collective, the Flow Genome Project, so we now have these resources as a bridge into where we find mankind, which is in a hyper-mechanical, analytical compartmentalization science, right? And so having those tools is a beautiful stepping stone in a way, but they only lead so far, right? And we can approach somatics as just technique, right? Technique, it's technology, right? We can stimulate the vagus nerve. We can find new ways to access the chemical codes, right? Stimulate the body with a deeper knowing of the nervous system to bring about ease. Well, ease for what? Ease for the sake of ease? Well, sometimes maybe, but what about ease as a platform for action, as a platform for a relational element with something that we can't understand? And so what I really try and compel people to do is to set aside time to not know, to find comfort in not knowing, and maybe even face their shadow a little bit in what they want to know, particularly in this time. We want the true data on COVID, right? And so in that, we can begin to allow the body to lead a little bit, because it's a great intelligence. And if I can get someone to that point who's never considered that before, it feels like a blessing to my life and theirs, What I'm looking for is for an emergent culture of the body to begin to come out of a person, and that their own personal pursuits become relational, and that their new way of being through this metamorphic process of movement becomes something that spills out into the community, into their families, into their relationship with the earth, maybe their relationship with God. Everybody in their orthodoxy and their hardening wants to know.
You used a very interesting phrase a few minutes ago, the lens of trauma. And I'm curious in what you're talking about, both for individuals and for these emergent communities, how much of this is about healing and releasing trauma, and how much of this is about learning new skills and understanding new capacities for being in the world? Or is it even possible to distinguish those?
Yeah, I don't believe it is possible to distinguish those things, right? And so a lens of trauma, right? The lens is constantly informing, giving context for how we meet and where we meet that which is coming towards us in our human experience. Form has function, right? And so we've taken on the responsibility of relationship with this body, this form. What is its function, right? With the striving of those we know, there's a service element, right? And so it requires an open-heartedness in a way, right? And there's onion skin layers of experience to get through for so many of us. The hurt, the rawness, right? It's informing us, giving context, prejudgment. We already know. We've thrown spears of definition, right? We've given nomenclature before interaction, right? What is that informed by? And in looking at this form of a body and looking for a function of, in this case, a clarity of thinking, yeah, a rhythmic warmth of feeling, and the freedom to perform our will aligned with our service destiny. You know, it's difficult for people to come in contact with the reality that a lot of their thinking and feeling is reflexive and reactive, born out of the subconscious. It might be a little tightening of the jaw just when the phone lights up and you see the name. It might have become a complete retraction, becoming scoliosis, right? It might be wearing the burdens of the entire world for so long that you can't look up and have the freedom of the limb, right? In stroke, a pulling in and a loss of sensation. What is lost in that limb in the freedom to do? A stroke is a great physiological trauma, right? And so we need to build consciousness in our own shadow work, first of all, to know when we're outside of the inner experience of peace. Receptivity, yet protected within the context of boundary. You know, boundaries I prefer to think of as, my teacher put it great as thresholds of experience or membranes of experience, the body space, personal space, the social spaces, the intrapersonal spaces. So trauma informs the subconscious, and movement, we're searching for balance. We're looking for that place where things light up. I mean, the mystery schools all speak of it, right? And how do we do it? Through flow. Flow becomes function, becomes form. And if in the flow, we can relate to something that is not the trauma, that is archetypical, that is beautiful, that is flowing, that is seen in nature all around us, perhaps the body can begin to remember.
I love this idea of boundaries. I'm very oriented toward thresholds. I feel like that's where we're simultaneously connected and differentiated, and where we discover the nuances and the richness of things that we might not otherwise see. Right? But how do we get to that place that's close enough but not too close? And what are the things that tend to keep a person from being able to find that exact threshold in any given moment?
Well, practice makes perfect. And it is that, it's a new awareness, right? And so somatics of the body, but really of a wholeness, somatics needs to look beyond that definition of just the body, but look to wholeness and experiencing the body as a wholeness. It's like a house, right? Are you in the library all the time? You need to dust out those will zones, And so that's the first place of inhabitation. We incarnate, right? They say we grow up, but I say we more grow in and out in rhythmic coupling. So being in the body 100% is hard. It requires practice. It requires play. It requires looking at things that are challenging for the body to do and embracing them, right? Finding that edge and pushing a little further throughout adulthood. Play is a big thing we do. I've worked with teens quite a bit, and you put people in competition and the shadows come right to the surface, which is a beautiful thing if we then hold a space for that shadow to be processed and given the opportunity to be illuminated by something new. So in the physicality, we have that first boundary, right? That home base striving for a function. Then we get out into the yard, right? We get out here into the personal space, right? And this is one of the most beautiful things that I believe Jamin McMillan brings in the study of spatial dynamics is interacting with that location a little bit more consciously, looking for how we inhabitate it. We talked about a lens of trauma. There was that, like I've had clients who were abused in boarding schools by nuns, and they're still holding that there. The body is still expressing that, and the personal space was invaded over and over again. Right? We know when someone's in our personal space uninvited, right? And it's got gates. People meet it in all different ways, Some people have a little squeaky gate, just enough for a narcissist to sneak in, Some people, it's all good, bro. It's wide open, right? What is that experience with that membrane being so permeable? And so as a location, when we hold that space for ourselves, we can bring it into so many activities and see how it collapses as we move through archetypical movements. And then the intrapersonal space where we share in subtleties with human beings, right? There's a responsibility in that too, right? Sexually and otherwise, there's the dude that'll be like within you from 20 feet away, right? Driving down that line, that sagittal intellect. And then there's a person that might be behind us for 40 minutes. We didn't know they were there. They're holding their space like a blanket, right? Keeping it close, because who knows what's out there. What happens then, though, is the world becomes too close. And then into that, from there, we go into the social spaces where, where life plays out, where politics plays out. Right? A very permeable membrane, a place where we might want to think about retaining a certain sovereignty to look through into a place coming home for maybe the form, the function, the home in itself can be carried out into the world in a way where we can be like a boulder in a creek, and that which doesn't serve our service passes around. Right? So an interaction of layers, space itself, well, that's a whole other topic. But then from there, and I will mention it here in this sphere, is the suprapersonal spaces. How do we relate to larger primal energetic aspects? In the beginning, gravity is a good one, where we're constantly related to this place 3,600 miles beneath our feet. We all have a meeting place there. It's the very same point, right? We live on a sphere, move through space where we don't fly off of it, right? And so that could be considered a suprapersonal space, another location to woo, to try and understand and how things fall into place in my life. Maybe it has something to do with this suprapersonal relationship. You know, I was thinking about flat earth theory the other day, and how there's like this truth to it in that we live on a sphere, but we experience it as a plane, right? Would you agree with that?
Sure. I mean, it looks pretty flat, doesn't it?
Yeah, man, it looks flat, right? And that's the human experience of it. And so there's like a validity in that. Why do we feel so good when we go to the beach, when we feel that expansive flatness? Maybe that's a supra-personal relationship, one that draws us out into something that is supportive, right?
This embodied three-dimensionality, I think, is I mean, people don't focus on it enough, but I think it's understandable to a lot of people that they could have a better relationship to the objects and the realms of space, including physical forces that are abstract, such as gravity. But there are also other things that are really non-material, right? Like mathematics and imagination and things like that. How does our body position itself relative to the immaterial and unseen elements of the world?
It's a big one, you know, and one that I feel like I'm just beginning to understand a little bit better. And this is where the meta sciences and the trajectory of the West will reach a finite point, because it's the threshold, it's the twin palms, where we step off into a realm where there are others. And this plays out in culture, right? And it's played out in culture throughout humanity, religion, philosophy, and all these aspects of humankind. This relational aspect to things unseen, the indigenous wisdom, the remembering, that there's a relational aspect that we took on with the body. What is the body? It's borrowed earth. I'll sit for a moment with the idea of animated dust. But even just as borrowed earth, what we play out in this borrowed earth is our interaction with she. And so this is where we get into the idea of wooing, you know, which was brought to me by my Kanaka brother, Kale, he that is first to cry. You know, my name's Hunter. He talked about the ancient hunters. It was considered a wooing process, almost romantic. And the master hunters would woo so well that the game would come and lay at their feet. And this aspect of wooing, I mean, we see it with the great minds. It's like, when did that imagination arise in you that you could communicate? It was, you know, it was on the long walk. It was outside of the compartmentalization of the studio so many times. You know, that hook came. Good thing I had my notepad, my recording device, right? And preparing for those aha moments is, I believe, finding the center point of orientation and utilizing the function of the body as a compass rose for certain pursuits, deepening the relationship of the anatomy to enter the mystery of not knowing, and allowing someone else to lead the dance. And that'll mean different things to different people. To pursue space itself, we need to be the fish that is interested in water. Right. And when we begin to orient in these larger spaces and bring it, we are passing through these spaces consciously, where there's so much energy dynamics. You know, Upledger describes space very well as an infinitesimal layering of folds, fabric, the akasha, right, where the records are held. So we pass through memory. Water is memory. And this elemental aspect of ourselves, Will we allow it to inform us? Because what if we will not only meet the what, the dynamics, but the who? Who else is in this fabric that perhaps I cannot see, but I can see, that I can see, that I can maybe not hear, but I can hear? Where? Here.
One of the things that intrigued me the most when we spoke last time was about bodies relating to time. And maybe you would say a few things, for people who are listening about the posture of optimal becoming and inheritance, how we're informed by the past and the future in our bodies in space.
Right. I mean, just quite simply in the beginning, are you ahead of yourself? Are you falling behind? Right. I want to say that what's important is that I express this is my personal experience of time and the activities I've chosen. All right. As a human form, there is a resting place, a carriage, and your head is not in front of your heart at that time. Right? The neck is not meant to bear so much weight all the time. In fact, the heart recedes when we're obsessed with the future. Right? So just this location of thinking can change the body. Right? And then similarly, if the heart is constantly anchored in the context of the past, there's something lost in the presence by the form not being informed by this central sun, the solar plexus, the middle sun, plexus, middle. The way I experience time, and we'll get it relates to a couple of our topics, one being the wooing, because I'm interested in my lineage, first of all, and I know so very little of it. But also as the flat earth theory, where we can relate to time as a corridor of experience, dharma, destiny, the karmic rivers flowing from behind. And my experience of time within this corridor, which is infinitely high, infinitely low, infinitely behind, and infinitely before us, is that though the future is constantly getting further away, in a way it is streaming towards me. And although the past events of my life are getting further behind me, they're informing me and so flowing towards me. And so my experience of time is of really a fourfold river. In space, there are no true continuous parallels, though. And so perhaps this parallel, as experienced through my disciplined pursuit of movement, is actually part of a lemniscate. So that something gets so far ahead of me that it's actually behind me. And why I relate it to the wooing is something was awoken me really in the past 2 years to know my blood. I've embraced this term American mutt, some people don't like it. I'm a mutt. I have an Ellis Island name. I have the privilege of white skin. I have an experience that is crass and mundane and, well, the polar of those things. And so I had an experience where for the first time, the gates really opened for me and I was able to perceive and speak with the ancestral and to be witnessed in that space by my brothers in the Sacred Sons who held that space, prepared that space, even some unbeknownst to them. And from there, I began to woo, to speak casually, to know, to be informed, and to approach time as an opportunity to clear the line, the lineage, the line of ages, the line of ages. And this is the human drama that has been lost as we left our equatorial origins and became orphans on the land and didn't have the melanated memory so much and found ourselves settlers. Some colonizers, some just settlers, still from an oppressed and a resilient people. And so I really want to allow them to live in my life and to inform me. You know, I long to remember the songs of my grandmothers and the ways of my grandfathers. And if I go at that in a mechanistic way, I can only get about 3 generations back with very foggy lenses. So what in the wooing, in the comfort of not knowing, finding comfort in the striving of not knowing, can I be informed by? With that, I'm gonna pour a little Hawthorne tea, where they brought me to she.
Yeah, these notions of she and wooing and the sacred sons, you know, invoke this great discourse of sexualized polarization. And it's a fascinating one, because I think one of the great puzzles for philosophers and non-dual mystics is how much of the universal is present in and as the particular, right? It's very profound to learn to experience just this as the form of the everything. And that's, as human beings, we have specific forms through which we have our inheritance, right? There's genetic differentiation and anatomical differentiation and psychocultural differentiation between masculine and feminine specializations. And it's a hard, ambiguous area for people, and not everybody feels they fit exactly, but we don't want to either overlook our universality and shape-shifting capacities, nor do we want to overlook the way we could become liberated by identifying more deeply with a particular form, including the form that you and I share of maleness. So I'm curious how you've been led toward this exploration of yourself as a man.
It was interesting. Through my 20s, I kind of had a habit. Wherever I went, I would look for what I was interested in being taught by the oldest woman I could find. And it was a good way. It was a good way. And male mentors throughout my life have been few, but very, very, very important. You know? And looking out at society, what's being asked of men, and where I found myself having exhausted the lone wolf possibilities, I had to look at myself and see what was out of balance, and it was the masculine. In some ways, I had shied away from the power. It's too much. It's too much for people, right? In a way, I felt like I was making room for what needed to be, which is femininity, you know? In the Celtic tradition of which my blood flows, you know, the soul of masculine warriors considered feminine. And so, you know, I think that's a big reason why, you know, cannabis is so popular with men, is because, you know, it softens into that soul space, that femininity and that flow, until it doesn't, and they become rigid within it. So for me, I was truly exhausted, physically, emotionally, because I had pursued metaphysics in an imbalanced way, in that I was pursuing it mechanistically, really, an accumulation of technology and knowledge. And so I just had to question at the beginning of 2020, you know, I suffered, well, you know, it's like a great humiliation to like think I had all that was was worthy of my pursuit. But I still had to admit to myself I was exhausted, depleted. And in the lone wolf was the blessing of being with myself, having the capacity for discipline within that lone wolf aspect, but it had run its course. And, my interactions with my sons has been amazing and trying throughout my life. And my oldest son just left the house, and I really was looking at what I had passed on, as what masculinity is. And then in the larger social scale, we're given what masculinity is, which is basically, as polarity unto itself, the lover and the killer, right? Violence and sex. And so I looked into the world, actually, through good fortune. I've always had good fortune, of destiny, to pay attention to relationships. And one relationship led me to the Sacred Sons. And they said, call in all lone wolves. I was like, oh shit, that's me. And, wisdom shall come out of the mouths of babes and sucklings. They're young brothers, younger than me. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go, and it was, life changing for me. I was able to rebuild my physicality through a new lens, to deepen my relationship with the masculine and accept the responsibility of it. Men are so hurt, and we're told to keep it down until it rots our bellies. And so how can we express this power, these archetypes of masculinity in a healthy way? And we say, keep the shadow out front, in remembrance. However, on a bigger level, and now is such an interesting time for this, is the idea of polarities itself. If we can think of a sphere, which is a sphere is one. What we think of one is a sagittal process of divide, the tangent, right? The binary, right? So all life expressed on the splitting. But what if those polarities throughout human experience move deeper into a peripheral relationship, creating a broad spectrum? This is how we see all life arise, between polarities, right? Between the fire and the ice, between the equatorial middle and the polar cap, between the blackness of space and the lightness of earth. Where does life arise? And what can we learn in the paradox, but also the tension places between polarity? And, this gets played out a lot right now with gender, right? And indigenous societies knew, this person's a two-spirit, right? They were within that tension, which is a magical place where life arises, right? And so it's interesting to see society feeling this impulse, speaking for this impulse on a social scale, I think where the danger lies is in over mechanizing it, right? And allowing the body to be too much of the focus. But really, it does need to be in the beginning. It's the commons. It is what we all share. We all have a body. Everybody has a body. Everybody is somebody. And now we have this kind of sweeping movement of the spectrum, right? And so for me, I look at it and I say, well, what wisdom is coming out of there? And what is coming out of the spectrum that is informed only by trauma? And is it there that it becomes overly mechanized and people take extreme steps to alter their physicality, And what if these are the medicine people that have come to bridge the gap, right? Rudolf Steiner actually spoke of genders through this huge look at time over epochs, and how genders are something that arise and fade, depending on where humanity's at in their development.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about it as being on a journey, right? I think, we hear the idea that when the first cells evolved on the planet, they didn't have gender yet. And so that's a fascinating idea. It took some time to produce it. That's fascinating to me. I was thinking while you were talking about a specific kind of example around this, which is this like half comical notion of man spreading, right? As an instance of sexualized embodiment. So a lot of men's bodies feel more comfortable when they sprawl out and take up a little more space. And it can have negative social connotations when it's insensitive to the space of others or gesturally extends culturally reinforced dominance. But at the same time, male bodies need to feel comfortable and potent and uncontracted. So in a world with other people, how do men responsibly find the amount of space they need in a given context?
Right. Right. Holding space for oneself in a way that isn't intrusive in the space of others. Yeah. It's funny. Like, I wish I saw more man spreading here in Seattle. These young men that are indebted to the industries that feed our information and social networks are burdened greatly and have made themselves very small. Let's look at man spreading as the result of the way we walk. I think it's more interesting to find the correction, not in the activity itself, but what about the guy whose feet are always facing in two directions, not quite sure he knows where he's going? Or maybe if we're going to take left as feminine and right as masculine, does he dip into the sagittal with his right foot, getting on that knife blade of intellect, judgment, and such? And so can a greater awareness for a man come by getting his feet flat on the ground in this parallel of time? One of the problems with hypermasculation, being muscle bound, flexation, keeping it in, keeping it together, requires a certain decompress, and the body will just take it, right? Oh, that's a leather couch. Because fuck, life's heavy, man, right? Gravity, right? It's like it can be almost seen as a falling into the womb of the mother, is embracing gravity in that full spread out, right? And then consciousness around social etiquette. There's a time and a place. What are we listening with when we're man spread? What is the location of our awareness? Right? Is it that which is preceding the head and heart that is doing the listening? Is there a protection in it in a way to stay primal, stay in like a relaxed alertness by keeping our primal energetics at the fore? And then, it's again, are we going to woo a new experience? Are we going to be phenomenologists to see if the dynamics in the room change when we change? Right? Are we going to see if our communication is a little better if we change our position, if we get on the floor and sit in a feminine position? Right? Is someone else's genius going to bless us in a room if we contain a little bit more? Is that interesting to us? It's interesting to me. The art of conversation is it's on its heels, man. It's the 9th round.
Well, I want to say that I appreciate you meeting these sometimes very obscure, abstract questions that I'm asking that, don't have rote answers that one can refer to. Yeah, I see it. You have to be present to answer them and move from the frame that I offer into some areas that I didn't expect in the answer. So I'm really appreciating this. Thank you.
Good on, brother. Yeah, I love this.
And along those same lines, here's another strange question. You just mentioned left and right, which are classically associated with masculine and feminine, both in the body and in the brain hemispheres. What does a good relationship and what does wooing look like between the hemispheres of the brain and between the halves of the body?
To me, this is about the emergent culture of the body, the emergent culture of the self. Disciplines give framework, context. I'm going to hopefully have an empirical, objective experience of something new about myself when I find a new form and a new function. But they literally hold something, right? They're holding something, which means there's a boundary in it. And as a somatic teacher, can we lead people to that place where their own emergent culture of self, of body, is informed by wooing a form, wooing an upright, wooing the inheritance of being upright? We're the only ones, right? Only ones with total autonomy of the limb and head. And while animals have much more athletic movements, they are limited by form. Humans are unlimited in the possibilities of movement. And so in seeking, we can do simple things. Do I retract more on the right side? What does that have to do with my masculine? The wooing is in the curiosity and the not knowing. And in the looking beyond books, right? And so technique, technology, relationship, body, building self-awareness, changing the narrative, which is a lens of experience, looking for what's emergent, what I couldn't plan, right? Experiencing clearly what happens when we shift this lens, this mind body, and bring it into things. Do things change for us? Do I now have more abundance that I have stopped completely pulling into my ribs at all times on my feminine side? Can I use that as a jumping off point into my relational with the earth? Right? We know that going in the woods affects the nervous system. What else? This body is borrowed from she. And so what are the opportunities in the wooing for an emergent culture of relationship, of cohabitation, cooperation? What are the possibilities? I'm curious.
Yeah, a few minutes ago you said the wooing is in the curiosity, and I thought that was beautiful and succinct. What's coming up for me right now is curiosity around tempo. I've spoken with a lot of neo-tantra teachers and developmental sexual therapists, and they tend to, one thing a lot of them say is they want to slow people down and, take more time with the different aspects of sexual interactions to discover more of the richness and nuance and subtlety. Absolutely. But also there's things you can learn by intentionally speeding up and getting more involved with your activities. So I'm curious from your point of view, how you think about the utility of tempo shifting.
Yeah, man. Again, it comes down to polarity. And as a human being, if our polarity between rest and action is very close, what can arise between it? If we begin to create more of an extreme tension between those polarities, then what happens? Is there now a greater spectrum of observation and interaction with human beings? We say that slow motion is the language of the reparative etheric. And the etheric can be seen like a flowing candle mold, and we are the wax poured within it, except the mold is continuously moving. And so slowing down is medicine. You know, we know this, right? Meditation and all that. I like to bring it into a conscious awareness. What is the tempo that I begin at? I'm going to meet myself where I am. I'm going to have the client meet themselves. What truly is the tempo that I find when I engage this activity? What happens when I slow it down? How much can I slow it down? Can I slow it down and still continue to remain in the form? Or does it become sticky, right? And speed, man, I mean, that's medicine too. For me, how, you know, I love this term, the quickness. Are you familiar with this term? Being in the quickness, in the flow, right? It's quick. We think quick. It's like a bubbling over effect. And a lot of time it's from the wells that were dug in deep slowness, right? Is this bubbling up of the quickness. So I say engage, man. Engage overdrive sometimes. And this is something that the young brothers helped me to re-embrace. You know, I was physically quite battered when I came to them, right? And I had become afraid to utilize that aspect of myself that's ferocious too. And in the ferocity and the elemental of the fire and the licking of the flames, the quickness, but also water, right? Because we know a river can rage. So within all polarities in our human experience, it's important to visit extremes, so long as they don't render us useless to our service and destiny.
Elemental ferocity is really intriguing, and it makes me think of the social discussion around toxic masculinity, which is partly a foolish discussion, reactionary, and a kind of demonization of normal, healthy male modes, but also sometimes a very serious consideration of how untrained, unregulated, non-relational masculinity can sabotage itself and the things it cares about. So there's a delicate balance there involved in health and growth and empowerment. But it seems like in a civilization that's increasingly top-down, artificial, and systemic, that we need to really maintain access to the kinds of aggression and disagreeableness and ferocity that are traditionally associated with masculine psychocultural biology. It's a complicated question, but how do we safely engage and explore and refine and integrate our aggression over time in ways that are increasingly beneficial to ourselves in the world rather than dangerous and in the wrong places?
Right. And this is one of the ways that I see the Sacred Sons so beautifully expressing a salve to a wound. Is we need to train together. We need to come together, and we need to meet one another in confrontation, right? And to not be afraid of confrontation because we don't know what we might do. Well, let's find out what you do. Let's see what happens. And this is a real edge for me, you know, because like I grew up getting beat up and all that. And I was like, box, wrestle? Why? Like, you know, I'm like, I don't want to get punched in the face. I know what that feels like. But now it's really becoming much more clear to me of how important that is on certain men's journeys. I don't believe that it's necessary for everyone. I do believe it is necessary when we engage the masculine to look at our own expression of ferocity, which can be very feminine as well, you know, not refined to that. But this idea of a toxic masculinity, things become toxic when they're stagnant, right? What happens to water if it doesn't move, if it's not incorporated into an ecosystem, right? It becomes toxic. And so I look at it less as sure, like, you know, all these war movies, the glorification of violence, all that is part of this narrative of our social contract. But I'm more interested in what happened to the space as it was left and became stagnant. And how do we stimulate that in a healthy way, right? We need to come together. It happens in community. It's very rare, the individuals that can cultivate that well, you know. I have the privilege of living near Tahoma, also known as Mount Rainier, 14,000-foot volcano down the way. And so, you know, often shrouded in clouds, but then all of a sudden Seattle will blossom, and there he is, this phallus. And there's a good lesson. It's like, there's so much power inside this sleeping giant, right? And am I finding a way to circulate that in a way that is protective for those around me, right? And these ideas of shifting the archetype of a warrior to more of a hero, I guess, and the idea that always ready, always in control, always protecting, right? And that's a cultural thing, right? And for so many of us, I feel it does need to be met in the rigors of it sometimes, to feel it, to understand, to go against someone who's bigger than you, right?
I really appreciate the sentiment that masculine aggression is toxic as a result of its stagnation, and that the stagnation for most people in most cases has to be undone through an education that comes through exploring that with other people. That's beautiful, I think. Another thing that comes up for me is the relation of this to lineage, which we talked about earlier, right? We as men and as everyone stand downstream from a long line of people who had to suffer terrible things. Things that we probably couldn't even imagine how awful they were. So we bear that trauma coming into us. So how do we reopen those nourishment channels and help the ancestors, or unlock the chinks in that hose so that the lineage can flow into us, when the lineages of all human beings, and in particular men in this discussion, are so fraught with so many terrible things inside and out that they went through?
First things first, you know, call your dad. You know, engage in that immediacy and its struggle, you know, the epigenetic memories and their relationship to the blood being a mystery themselves, again, is a relational element, right? And this is, you know, having interacted with, you know, the meta scene quite a bit, this is that edge in a way, right? We need to be careful not to over sanitize, to foresee every problem along the way, to organize and stack in a way for a lack of friction, because in the friction, we'll find gift if we engage in the conflict. So I think just knowing, giving room to that thought isn't necessarily my own. And I'm going to put it in its place for a minute. And I'm going to woo a grandfather. I find stereotypes really helpful in a way, in that they often provide a polarity or extreme. And so for me, in wanting to know why my hurt is playing out this way, and wanting assistance, humbling into a realm I don't know, that was brought to me through the radical hospitality of indigenous peoples and diaspora people. How will I go about it in a way that is intelligent and feeling? And so for me, that was to look at what I can know. Okay, Eastern European Jews on my father's side, Czechoslovakia, Russia, they were tailors. Both my fathers worked with light. Those are interesting archetypes, suits and light. And then I've got on my mother's side, Scotch, Irish, and German. And I look at those people and the possibilities of the stereotype or archetype within them. So German, rigid but disciplined, fiercely intellectual, but need a loosener in order to get here. These are stereotypes, but they're also informative if I look at the inverse. So in my Scotch Irish, it's like, oh, yeah, the appetites, right? You know, the wet Irish, whatever it is, you know, like, and I can identify that in myself, like this, let me taste life, you know, give me another. What about the forest magic? What about the relational that my blood might remember? That's on the inverse of that. You know, with the Eastern European Jews, neurosis, on the run, you know, this deep-seated fear coupled with a blinding faith, right? So in one's own wooing, in their own pursuit, I think it's helpful to know what you can, look at it, but look at it in terms of archetypes and then engage at times. It's like, I'm being too rigid in my life. I'm going to address, literally woo my German line. And those who have stepped into the realms will know that in the realms of the ancestors, there is no separation. There are no tribes. But in the blood, we are informed by tribe, by epigenetic memory, and by the rhythms of the waters of those that are our forbearance. How deep are you going to take it? How honest with yourself are you going to be about it? Are you going to find such comfort in not knowing that you can ask the right questions? It's a big one, bro. It's where we are.
The stereotype thing is fascinating. You know, it's very easy for people to mentally be in favor of archetypal and archetypical understandings. But when it comes to stereotypes, there's a lot of justified, but also enculturated reaction to it, right? The mere fact of thinking in stereotypes is often a reason to demonize or exclude people. Well, they, you know, they're phrasing reality in terms of stereotypes, and therefore they are the problematic members of our society, and we don't have to listen to them. And yet there's something about both archetypes and stereotypes that are like letters in a language of embodiment, right? Hieroglyphs. That's fascinating to me. I don't really have a question. I just thought it was neat.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, and it's fraught with cultural dangers, right? For stereotypes, you know. And it's like, but it's part of the story, you know. Why were Jews constantly on the run? Why were my people feeling like they had to get out quick, right? And you know, they say, you know, Jews are hoarders of monies, right? It's like, well, they're actually good at money, right? Which becomes then a stereotype, which then becomes a scapegoating, stepping off point to induce violence and rage and allow the toxic, that which is fermented and stagnant, to erupt onto people, and they have to go on the run. And so what the suggestion is what happens if we relate to people where we invert it? We look for the deeper polarity. Oh, we're struggling in a way they're not. What if we approach humility and woo in the relational from being completely open, asked to be taught? Oh, you say $1 doesn't circulate outside of the Jewish community before it's been spent 10 times. Oh, that's a good idea. Right? And so this, and where we find ourselves now is the illusion of polarity between right and left, right? And really, it's a very narrow spectrum that arises within it in terms of the ideas expressed, the aggressions, and the base human experiences being vomited all around us in space all the time, right? The body is the narrative. We can only meet ourselves where we are today. Approach it like a mystery, a school, the anatomy.
Schools are interesting because they have an element of discovery and an element of discipline, right? And there's a lot of ways that people have learned over the ages to discipline and train the body through various procedures. But there's also this sense in which something is lost if we conform ourselves to a routine. That there's something that's constantly changing that the body has to be able to find in each moment that might go through a discipline for a while and then suddenly curve off in another direction. So I'm curious, like, how do we let the body lead us without just becoming unreliable, undisciplined animals? How do we get that balance correct?
Right. And pedagogy is obviously a massive topic to which I will refer you to our friend, Dr. Zach Stein. Discipline is a necessity, right? And the easiest way to think about it is jazz, right? We stay rigorous within the forms until all of a sudden the cage blows apart and we improvise freely in the context of where we find ourselves, right? Discipline is lost in entertainment culture. Because that which we used to be rewarded with by taking a spear and driving it through the heart of our prey, that which we wooed, that will then bring food to our family, bring us sex, we would get hormonal dumps. When that is so readily available, the motivation is under attack. The will is severely under attack. And so discipline in the relationship to will throughout a child's formative developmental stages is, in my opinion, very important. I'm not huge into the unschooling thing. I realize, education needs to be completely reformed, but where I meet people, where I find people, is they're longing to cultivate discipline alone. And as adults, I think it is very, 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 very difficult. And so it's a privilege and to be able to do that in our adulthood, to gather and to learn anew, and how society approaches that, you're going on retreat. It's like, well, sort of. It's going to be a lot of hard work, I hope. Discipline, disciple to what? It's these right there in the word, there is a devotional aspect. And so it again comes back to the curiosity and how we apply it. And if our curiosity is constantly disrupted by entertainment, we find ourselves in a dangerous place as society as the poles shrink.
Well, I'm out of questions, man. What else do you want to talk about? Or what should I have asked you that I haven't asked you?
I would really just want to talk about fear just a little bit.
Okay.
Just because I find it so pertinent in our shared experience and how it plays out in us. And how do we approach it? And can we actually woo fear in a way that it becomes a platform for transformation, as a platform for humility, most of all right now? Can we say that we will find that edge, without knowing, but with a willingness to find courage and move forward in an open and cooperative manner. Fear itself plays out on the physicality in such a severe, severe way. So the chicken or the egg, begin with the somatics, face the fear arises, move into the somatics, be a body. Look at death. Woo death, to know death. All right. I'm not really interested in being a life coach. I'm more interested in being a death coach. Because it is the only sure thing. And our relationship to death is fueling so much of what we are experiencing as a human tribe right now. It's of the utmost importance to understand death and to face one's own relationship, which is a relationship to the physicality, which is where we seek school, which is where we seek ease, sensation, and wonderful experience. And this has been a wonderful experience, Layman. Thank you so much.
Yeah, death is an appropriately terminal note to end on. Thanks, Hunter.
You're welcome, brother. Thank you.